The alarms on my homeworld had already stopped ringing by the time I reached the council station, because there was nothing left for them to warn us about. Every warning had already come true. My name is Corin Vex, and I am the last free voice of the Drenic people, sent across the stars with a single task: to convince a room full of strangers that my world was worth saving before it burned away to nothing. I did not sleep during the journey. I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reports scrolling past me again, the swelling of our sun, the failing shields over our northern cities, the last transmission from my sister telling me that the reservoirs were boiling in the low valleys. 600 million of my people were still down there, waiting for a miracle that no one on my homeworld had the power to build. I was the miracle they were counting on, and I did not feel like one. I felt like a man carrying an ocean in his hands, terrified that every drop would slip through my fingers before I reached the shore. The council station rose out of the dark like a cathedral, built by 100 different gods, each species adding its own spires and domes, until the whole structure looked less like a building and more like an argument frozen in metal. I had heard stories about this place since I was a child, how it held the peace between species who once tried to destroy each other, how it settled disputes that could have ended entire worlds. I believed those stories. I believed them the way a drowning man believes in the shore he cannot yet see. A Silic attendant met me at the docking ring, its long limbs folding in the practiced motion of formal greeting. It told me the council would hear my petition in 3 cycles, which in their measured time meant nearly 2 full days. I told the attendant that my people did not have 2 days to spare on politeness, that every hour we waited was an hour closer to a sun that would not wait for anyone's schedule. The attendant only tilted its head, the way beings do when they have heard desperate words so many times that they no longer feel the weight of them, and repeated that the council would hear my petition in 3 cycles. I spent those 2 days pacing the corridors of the visitors' wing, rehearsing the same words until they lost their shape in my mouth. I practiced the numbers, the projected loss of life, the timeline of our sun's collapse, the exact tonnage of ships it would take to move even a fraction of my people to safety. I practiced looking calm, because I had been told that calm delegates were taken seriously, and desperate ones were not. I practiced smiling in the way that Drenic faces are supposed to smile when speaking to strangers, though nothing about what was happening to my world made me want to smile at all. On the second night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing at a viewport that looked out over a slow river of starlight, ships gliding between docking rings, like fish moving through still water. Somewhere out there, past the edge of what I could see, my homeworld was still turning, still holding 600 million lives in its hands, still hoping that I would not fail them. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and made myself a promise. I would not leave that chamber until someone listened. I did not know yet how many species could sit in the same room and still manage not to hear a single word. When the morning of the hearing came, I dressed in the formal robes of a Drenic emissary, robes my father had worn before me when he sat on our world's council, robes that were meant to carry the weight of a whole civilization on their shoulders. I looked at myself in the mirror of my quarters and did not recognize the person staring back. My eyes were hollow from 2 nights without sleep. My hands would not stop trembling. I told myself it did not matter how I looked, only how well I could make them understand what was coming. The chamber itself was larger than anything I had imagined, a vast amphitheater ringed with tiered seating that rose so high the topmost rows disappeared into shadow. Delegates from every corner of known space filled those seats, some with bodies built for crushing gravity, some so slight they seemed to float above their chairs, some hidden entirely behind shimmering fields that translated their forms into shapes the rest of us could bear to look at. It was, in its own strange way, beautiful, a gathering of nearly every thinking species that had ever reached beyond its own sky, sitting together instead of at each other's throats. I remember thinking, in that first breathless moment, that if any place in the galaxy could save my people, it would be this one. I was given a position at the center of the chamber floor, a small circle of pale light meant to hold whoever stood there and nowhere else. Above me, the presiding officers of the council sat behind a long curved desk, ancient and unreadable, their faces marked with the kind of patience that comes only from centuries of watching younger species make the same mistakes over and over again. One of them, an elder of the Vorn people, motioned for me to begin, and the entire chamber fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs. I began the way I had rehearsed. I told them who we were, a people of farmers and builders and quiet scholars, a people who had never once raised a weapon against another star system. I told them about our sun, how the readings had first come in 11 months ago, small and easy to dismiss, and how they had grown worse every month since, until our own scientists confirmed what none of us wanted to believe. Our star was dying early, decades before any model had predicted, and it was taking our world down with it. I gave them numbers because I had been told numbers move minds, that words cannot. 600 million people, 40% of our surface already too hot to sustain crops. 11 months until the oceans along our equator would begin to boil away entirely. 2 years, perhaps less, before the whole planet became uninhabitable. I told them that we did not have the ships to move even a tenth of our population, that our closest allies had already sent their regrets along with polite reasons why they could offer nothing more than sympathy. I told them that I had come here because the Council was our last hope, the one body in the galaxy with enough combined strength to save a dying world if it chose to. When I finished, the silence in the chamber did not feel like the silence of people moved to compassion. It felt like the silence of people waiting for someone else to speak first, the way strangers in a crowd wait for someone braver to step forward so they will not have to. I looked up at the long curved desk, at the ancient, unreadable faces of the presiding officers, and I felt the first cold thread of fear that this room, for all its grandeur, might not save my people at all. The Vorn elder finally spoke, her voice slow and measured, each word placed like a stone. She thanked me for my testimony. She said the Council recognized the gravity of my people's situation, and then she said the word that would haunt every hour of what followed. Procedure. She said the matter would be referred to committee for review, that resource allocation of this scale required careful study, that precedent must be considered before any fleet could be authorized to leave Council space. She said this as though she were describing the weather, as though 600 million lives could simply wait in a queue behind older, more familiar business. I felt something crack open inside my chest. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, how long such a review would take. She answered without apparent shame that similar petitions in the past had taken between 1 and 3 years to reach a final vote. I told her, my voice rising despite every effort to keep it level, that my people would not survive 1 year, let alone 3. She only inclined her head, the same gesture the attendant had given me 2 days before, the gesture of someone who has heard desperate words so many times they no longer carry any weight at all. I looked around the chamber then, searching every tier of seats for some sign that I was not alone in my horror. I saw delegates murmuring quietly to one another, some already reaching for other documents, already moving on to whatever business would follow mine. I saw a few faces that seemed to hold something like pity, but pity offered nothing to a dying world. Pity did not build ships. Pity did not carry water to a burning field. I understood, in that moment, standing alone in my small circle of pale light, that this magnificent chamber, this gathering of every great civilization in known space, might let my entire people die simply because no one wanted to be the first to move. That was the moment I stopped thinking like an emissary and started thinking like a man who had nothing left to lose. I thought of my sister's voice on that last transmission, thin and crackling, telling me the reservoirs were boiling. I thought of children in our northern cities who had never known a day without the hum of failing shields overhead. I thought of 600 million futures balanced on the patience of strangers who measured urgency in years instead of days. I did the only thing I had left. I knelt. Among my people, kneeling is not a small gesture. It is the oldest and most sacred plea in our culture, reserved for moments when nothing remains but complete and total submission, when a person lays down every shred of pride they possess and offers only their need. I had seen it done twice in my life, once at my grandmother's funeral and once when my father begged a rival village for grain during the great drought of my childhood. I never imagined I would kneel before an entire galaxy, but there, in the center of that vast chamber, with every species in known space watching, I lowered myself to the cold floor and pressed my forehead against it. I do not remember every word I said after that. I remember the sound of my own voice, breaking apart the careful, rehearsed speech I had practiced for 2 sleepless nights, replacing it with something rawer and truer. I begged them to look past their committees and their precedents and simply see what was happening, a whole world dying in real time while its people waited for permission to be saved. I told them I did not care what rules I was breaking by kneeling in their sacred chamber. I told them I would stay on that floor until someone, anyone, gave me a reason to believe my people would live. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. And then, from a section of seating I had barely noticed before, a section holding a species so young to interstellar contact that many delegates still spoke of them with faint condescension, I heard a chair scrape back against the floor. I looked up, my forehead still marked with the cold of the tile, and saw a human woman rising to her feet before the presiding officers had even acknowledged that anyone wished to speak. Her name, I would learn only moments later, was Laura Bennett, and she would become the first thread in a rope that pulled my entire world back from the edge of extinction. But in that instant, all I knew was that someone in that vast, indifferent chamber had finally stood up, and for the first time since the alarms on my homeworld had gone silent, I let myself believe that I had not knelt for nothing. Laura Bennett did not wait for permission to speak. She simply spoke, her voice cutting through the vast chamber with none of the careful ceremony the other delegates used when addressing the council. She said that she had listened to every number I had given, and that she did not need a committee to tell her what those numbers meant. She said a world was dying while people who called themselves leaders debated whether dying quickly enough was a matter worth interrupting their schedules for. I had never heard anyone speak to the council in that tone before, and judging by the sudden murmur rippling through the tiers of seats around her, neither had most of the delegates in that chamber. The Vorn elder at the long curved desk raised a hand, the universal gesture across 100 species for silence, and reminded Laura Bennett that she had not been recognized to speak. Laura did not sit down. She said that she understood she had not been recognized and that she was speaking anyway, because somewhere out past the edges of this station, 600 million people were running out of time while everyone in this room recited rules about who was allowed to open their mouth first. I remained kneeling on the cold floor, my forehead still faintly numb from the tile, watching this stranger risk her standing in the council to say the thing I had been too afraid to say myself. A ripple of disapproval moved through several sections of the chamber. I saw a Thorin delegate lean toward a colleague, lips moving in what I imagined was some quiet remark about the manners of the newest species to join this great gathering of civilizations. I saw a Silic elder fold all 4 of his upper limbs across his chest, in obvious displeasure. But I also saw something else, something I would only later understand was the beginning of everything that followed. I saw other members of the human delegation rising from their seats, one after another, not in some coordinated show of unity, but simply because each of them, on their own, had reached the same breaking point Laura had reached first. A man near the back of the human section stood next, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had spent years working with his hands before ever setting foot in a chamber like this one. His name was Daniel Cross, and he did not bother addressing the presiding officers at all. He spoke directly to Laura, asking her, loud enough for the whole chamber to hear, how many ships his people currently had sitting idle at the nearest shipping hub. Laura answered without hesitation, naming a number that made several delegates around them visibly startle. Daniel Cross nodded once, pulled a small device from his coat, and began speaking quietly into it, already coordinating something that had nothing to do with waiting for the council's permission. The Vorn elder called for order, her voice sharper now, edged with something close to alarm. She reminded the chamber that unauthorized fleet movement across council space violated a dozen different treaties, that resources belonging to any delegation remained under the jurisdiction of the Council until formally released, that this was not how matters of this magnitude were decided. Laura Bennett turned toward the long, curved desk and asked, with a calm that somehow felt more dangerous than anger would have, whether the Council intended to physically stop human ships from delivering food, water, and shelter to a dying world, or whether they simply intended to talk about stopping them for the next several years. No one answered her. I pushed myself up from the floor then, my legs unsteady beneath me, my chest tight with something I did not yet have a name for. It was not quite hope, not yet, because hope still felt like something too fragile to trust after everything the Council had already shown me. But it was close. It was the first crack of light through a door I had believed was sealed shut. I looked at Laura Bennett, standing in open defiance of an entire governing body older than her species' first attempts at spaceflight, and I did not understand yet why she was doing this. I only understood that she was. The chamber grew louder as more delegates began speaking over one another, some demanding order, some demanding explanations, some simply trying to be heard above the rising noise. Through the confusion, I noticed a woman near the front of the human section, older than the others, her silver hair pulled back in a simple knot, watching the unfolding chaos with an expression of quiet calculation rather than alarm. Her name, I would come to learn, was Ruth Fields, and she held a position of authority within the human delegation that none of the shouting around her seemed to touch. When she finally rose to speak, the noise in the chamber gradually fell away, not because the Council commanded silence, but because something in her manner demanded it on its own. Ruth Fields did not raise her voice. She said that her people had only recently joined this Council, that they were still learning its customs, its patience, its careful and deliberate ways of settling disputes between civilizations far older than their own. She said she respected that patience in matters where patience served a purpose. And then she said that patience in the face of a dying world was not wisdom, it was simply cruelty wearing the mask of process. She said her people had a saying, one she hoped the Council would come to understand in time, that some debts to another species cannot wait for a vote, they can only be paid. The Vorn elder attempted once more to steer the chamber back toward procedure, reminding everyone present that the Council existed precisely to prevent hasty decisions that individual species might later regret, that history was littered with the wreckage of civilizations who acted first and considered consequences only afterward. It was, I could tell, a genuine belief, not simply a stalling tactic. The Vorn people had seen wars born from impulsive decisions, and their caution was not without reason. But reason, I was beginning to understand, meant very little to a child watching the last river in her country boil away to steam. Ruth Fields acknowledged the Vorn elder's point with something almost like respect, then said that her people understood the value of careful decisions, but that there was a difference between careful and paralyzed, and that this Council, in its long history of preventing hasty mistakes, had apparently also perfected the art of preventing timely rescues. She said that humanity did not intend to wait for a vote to save a species that would not survive long enough to see one held. She said this not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, the way one might describe the weather outside a window. I stood in my small circle of pale light, forgotten for the moment by everyone except perhaps myself, and watched an argument unfold that would decide the fate of everyone I had ever loved. Around the chamber, other delegations began to add their own voices, some in support of the humans' urgency, most still clinging to the comfort of procedure. A Thorin delegate argued that allowing one species to bypass Council authority set a dangerous precedent that could unravel decades of careful diplomatic balance. A younger Silic representative countered that the balance the Thorin delegate wished to preserve had already cost my world 11 months of inaction, and that balance built on the suffering of others was no balance worth preserving. Through it all, Laura Bennett remained standing, her attention fixed not on the arguing delegates around her but on me, still frozen in my circle of light at the center of the chamber floor. She asked me, cutting through the noise with a question rather than a declaration, how many ships my people would need to begin moving our most vulnerable populations first, the children, the elderly, those already suffering from the failing shields in our northern cities. I had prepared this number months ago, had recited it in my sleep during the long journey to this station, and yet standing there, hearing someone actually ask for it with the intention of acting on the answer, my voice nearly failed me entirely. I told her the number. She did not flinch at its size the way I had expected every delegate in that chamber to flinch. She simply turned to Daniel Cross, still speaking quietly into his small device, and asked him what capacity their people could realistically commit within the week. He answered with another number, smaller than what my people needed, but larger than anything the council had offered in 11 long months of silence. And Laura nodded, as though this were simply the beginning of a plan already taking shape in her mind, rather than the wild improvisation it actually was. The Vorn elder, watching this exchange unfold entirely outside her control, called once more for order, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. She reminded the human delegation, her voice now carrying an edge of something close to desperation of her own, that the council had not authorized any fleet movement, that proceeding without formal approval would place their entire delegation in violation of treaties spanning centuries. Ruth Fields turned to face her directly, and for the first time since the hearing began, I saw something shift in the older woman's expression, something that looked almost like sorrow beneath her calm. She said that her people had only been part of this galaxy's community for a short time, and that in that short time they had already seen this council debate, delay, and defer, while worlds suffered in the silence left behind. She said she did not say this to insult the council or its long and often admirable history of preventing conflict, but simply to explain why humanity, young and imperfect as it was, could not in good conscience wait for permission to prevent a tragedy it had the power to stop. She said that if the price of saving a dying world was standing in violation of a treaty, then her people would gladly pay that price and answer for it afterward, because some choices were not actually difficult at all once you stripped away every excuse built to make them seem that way. The chamber fell into another long silence, though this one felt different from the silence that had followed my own plea. That earlier silence had been the silence of indifference, of a room waiting for someone else to act. This silence felt like the silence of a room realizing all at once that someone had already acted, and that the rest of them were now left deciding only whether to help or to simply watch. I do not know how long that silence lasted. It felt like hours, though I suspect it was closer to a few long, breathless minutes. I remained standing in my circle of light, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch, as an argument I had started with a single desperate plea grew into something far larger than myself, something that no longer needed my voice to keep moving forward. And somewhere above the arguing delegates, above the ancient officers still trying to reclaim control of a chamber slipping steadily from their grasp, I allowed myself, for the very first time since the alarms on my homeworld had gone silent, to believe that my people might actually live. The council never voted that day. I want to be honest about that, because the story of what happened to my people is often told as though the council rose together and chose to save us, and that is not what happened at all. What happened was smaller and stranger and, in its own way, far more remarkable. A handful of people from a young species decided that waiting for a room full of strangers to agree was a luxury my world could not afford, and they simply began without them. I was escorted from the chamber floor once the session finally broke apart, into confused clusters of arguing delegates, none of whom seemed able to agree on anything except that something unprecedented had just occurred in front of them. A young Silic attendant guided me toward a side chamber, meant for petitioners awaiting further instruction, the same kind of quiet holding room where I imagine countless other desperate emissaries had once waited for news that never came. I expected to sit there for hours, perhaps days, while the council debated what to do about a human delegation that had all but declared it intended to act with or without their blessing. Instead, less than an hour later, the door to that side chamber opened, and Laura Bennett stepped through it alone. She looked different away from the noise of the main chamber, younger somehow, though I would later learn she was not young at all by human standards. She had the tired eyes of someone who had spent the last hour making a great many decisions very quickly, decisions that would matter far beyond the walls of this station. She sat down across from me without any of the formal distance the Vorn elder had kept, and she asked me, quite plainly, to tell her everything about my homeworld, not the numbers I had rehearsed for the council, but the actual details, the shape of our cities, the layout of our coastlines, the places where the most people were concentrated, and the places where evacuation routes might already exist. I found myself talking for a long time, longer than I had spoken to anyone since leaving my homeworld. I told her about the northern cities, built along cliffs that had once been considered beautiful, and were now simply vulnerable, exposed to a sky that no longer protected them the way it used to. I told her about the southern farmlands, already turning to dust as our rivers thinned. I told her about my sister, still down there somewhere, coordinating what little relief effort our own people could manage with failing equipment and dwindling supplies. Laura listened to all of it without interrupting, occasionally asking a quiet question that showed she was not simply gathering information, but actually picturing the world I described, actual people, rather than abstract numbers on a casualty projection. When I finished, she told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that her own species had a history of arriving late to disasters, of watching suffering unfold on distant screens and telling themselves someone else would surely handle it, until eventually enough of them decided they were tired of being the someone else who never showed up. She said that history had taught some hard lessons about what happens when help waits too long, and that her people, imperfect as they were in nearly every other way, had at least learned that particular lesson well. Outside the side chamber, the station had already begun to change in ways I could not yet fully see. Word of what had happened in the council chamber spread quickly, not just among the human delegation but across the entire station, carried by attendants and observers who had witnessed a species barely a century into interstellar contact stand up in the middle of the galaxy's oldest governing body and simply refuse to wait. Some delegations were scandalized. I heard, secondhand, that a Thoran representative had filed a formal complaint before the day was even finished, demanding that the human delegation be sanctioned for what he called reckless disregard of established order. Other delegations, quieter ones, sent private messages of support, the kind of careful diplomatic language that meant they agreed but did not wish to say so publicly where it might cost them something. None of that seemed to slow the humans down at all. By the time night fell over the station, if a place built from 100 different species architecture could be said to have anything resembling night, Daniel Cross found me in the corridor outside the side chamber and told me, with the same blunt directness Laura had shown earlier, that the first wave of ships would be ready to depart within 3 days. 3 days. I had prepared myself to wait years for a fraction of that promise from the council. And here was a man I had known for less than a single afternoon telling me it would take 3 days to begin saving my people. I asked him how this was possible, how a single delegation could commit resources on this scale without the endless committees and reviews that had defined every other interaction I'd had with the council. He explained, in the practical way I would come to recognize as common among his people, that humanity kept a standing reserve of transport vessels for disaster relief within their own systems, ships originally built to respond to storms and other emergencies on their own worlds, retrofitted over the years for exactly this kind of situation. He said that most of those ships were currently doing very little, sitting in docks awaiting the next crisis, and that as far as he and Laura and Ruth Fields were concerned, my homeworld's crisis counted just as much as any human one would have. I asked him, because I could not help myself, why his people were doing this at all. We were strangers to them. We offered no strategic advantage, no valuable resources, nothing beyond gratitude that might never be repaid in any form they could use. Daniel Cross considered the question for a long moment, the kind of pause that told me he was actually thinking about his answer rather than reciting something he had said many times before. He said that where he came from, you did not wait to help someone until you knew what helping them would cost you or earn you in return. He said that kind of thinking led to a lot of good people dying while everyone else calculated the odds. Not every human agreed with the speed of what Laura and Daniel and Ruth had set into motion. I learned this later from Grace Turner, a young pilot assigned to one of the first relief vessels being prepared for departure, who told me quietly one evening that several officials back on human worlds were furious about resources being committed without formal government approval, that there would likely be consequences waiting for Laura and the others once this crisis passed. I asked Grace whether that frightened her, whether the possibility of trouble back home made her want to slow down or reconsider. She laughed, not unkindly, and told me that she had signed up to fly relief missions specifically because she wanted to be somewhere useful when the world needed someone to show up, and that whatever paperwork trouble came afterward seemed like a fair price for not letting an entire species die while everyone waited for permission. I began to understand, over those 3 days, that what I was witnessing was not some grand, coordinated plan handed down from human leadership with careful deliberation. It was something messier and more human than that, a scattering of individual people, some in positions of authority, and some simply willing volunteers, all deciding independently that this was worth doing, and then finding ways to make it happen despite the obstacles stacking up around them. Ruth Field spent those 3 days locked in increasingly tense communications with officials back on human worlds, working to secure at least enough retroactive authorization to keep the ships from being recalled entirely. Laura Bennett spent them coordinating logistics with a speed that left even the station's most efficient attendants struggling to keep pace. Daniel Cross spent them simply working, moving between docking rings and supply depots, making sure that when the ships finally launched, they would launch with everything my people actually needed rather than whatever the council might have eventually approved after years of careful study. On the evening before the first ships were set to depart, I stood again at the viewport where I had made my quiet promise 2 nights before the hearing, watching the same slow river of starlight drift between docking rings, except now that river included vessels bearing markings I did not recognize, human ships being loaded and prepared for a journey to a world most of their crews had never even heard of a week earlier. Laura Bennett found me there, and we stood together in silence for a while before she finally spoke. She told me that she did not know if this would be enough, that even with everything they had managed to gather in 3 days, the scale of what my people needed was larger than any single delegation could fully provide on their own. She said the council might still refuse to authorize a larger, sustained relief effort, that other species might continue arguing about precedent and procedure, while my world's crisis stretched on for months or years beyond these first ships. She said she wanted me to understand that, so that whatever happened next would not come as a fresh wound on top of everything I had already suffered. I told her that 3 days ago I had knelt on a cold chamber floor, believing my entire world would die, while 100 species watched and did nothing. I told her that whatever came next, however incomplete or imperfect, was already more than I had believed possible when I walked into that chamber. She did not answer right away. She simply looked out at the ships being prepared beyond the glass, her expression unreadable in the dim light, and after a while she said something I have never forgotten. She said that hope was not a promise that everything would be fine. It was simply a reason to keep working as though it might be, and that her people had built an entire history out of doing exactly that, again and again, long after wiser and more patient civilizations had told them to give up and accept things as they were. I did not sleep again that night, but for the first time since leaving my homeworld, it was not fear keeping me awake. The first ship broke away from the docking ring 3 days after I had knelt on the chamber floor, and I stood at the observation deck with my hands pressed against the glass, watching it vanish into the long dark toward a sun that was killing my homeworld 1 degree at a time. Its name, painted along the hull in letters I could not read until Grace Turner told me what they meant, was the Amelia Cole, named, she explained, after a relief worker from human history who had spent her life rushing toward disasters other people fled from. I thought it was a fitting name for a ship that carried the first real hope my people had received in 11 long months. I traveled aboard the second vessel to depart, a converted cargo hauler that Daniel Cross personally oversaw, its hold stripped of whatever it had once carried and refitted in a matter of days with medical bays, water reclamation units, and enough emergency shelter material to house thousands of displaced families. Daniel walked me through the ship before launch, pointing out systems his crew had built and rebuilt in a frantic scramble of long nights and shorter tempers, and I understood, watching the exhaustion etched into every face I passed, that what I was witnessing was not effortless generosity. It was people pushing themselves past reasonable limits because they had decided my world's crisis mattered enough to justify the cost. The journey to my homeworld felt shorter than the journey away from it had felt, though I know that was simply the difference between traveling toward hope and traveling toward desperation. I spent much of it in the ship's small communications bay, relaying coordinates and evacuation priorities to my sister, who had somehow kept a skeleton network of local coordinators functioning despite failing power grids and a government that had all but collapsed under the weight of the crisis. Her voice, when it finally came through clearly enough to understand, cracked with something I had not heard from her since we were children. It took me a moment to recognize it as relief. When we finally arrived in orbit above my homeworld, I was not prepared for what I saw. I had left only a handful of weeks earlier, and yet the world below looked different already. The northern coastlines visibly duller, the atmosphere carrying a faint haze that had not been there before. Our sun, once a familiar and gentle presence in our sky, now burned with an intensity that made the daylight side of the planet look almost hostile to look upon directly. I understood, seeing it with my own eyes rather than through the sterile language of scientific reports, exactly how little time we actually had left. The evacuation began in the northern cities first, where the failing shields had left entire populations exposed to temperatures no Drenic body could survive for long. Daniel's ship, along with 3 others that arrived within hours of us, settled into a coordinated pattern above the largest of these cities, shuttlecraft descending in careful rotation to lift as many people as each run could safely carry. I went down with the first shuttle, unable to remain aboard the relief ship while my own people faced this alone, and the moment my feet touched the cracked, sun-scorched ground of my homeworld again, I understood the true scale of what we were attempting. Thousands of people had gathered at the evacuation point, drawn by broadcasts my sister's network had managed to send out across whatever channels still functioned. Families stood in long, exhausted lines, carrying what little they could manage, children too tired or frightened to cry anymore, elders supported by relatives who had themselves grown thin from months of rationed water and failing crops. The heat pressed down on all of us like a physical weight, and I remember thinking, standing there amid so much visible suffering, how easy it would have been for the Council to let all of this remain nothing more than numbers on a report, safely distant and easy to set aside. Sam Whitfield, a young volunteer who had joined the relief effort despite having no formal military or medical training, worked beside me at the loading point, helping guide families toward the shuttles with a patience that never seemed to waver, no matter how chaotic the crowds became. I asked him at one point, during a brief lull between shuttle departures, why someone so young had chosen to leave the relative safety of his own world to stand in the scorching heat of a planet he had no connection to at all. He told me, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, that he had watched footage of the council hearing before he left, had seen me kneeling on that chamber floor, and that something about it had made him unable to simply go back to his ordinary life, knowing ships were being organized to help, and doing nothing himself. The first day of evacuation was the hardest, not because the process itself was flawed, but because the sheer scale of the crisis made every success feel small against the scope of everything still left undone. We managed to lift nearly 20,000 people from the northern cities in those first 18 hours, and yet I knew, standing amid the dwindling but still enormous crowds waiting their turn, that 20,000 was a fraction of the 600 million still counting on rescue. I found myself, more than once, fighting the urge to simply sit down amid the chaos and weep from the impossibility of it all. It was Ellen Marsh, an engineer traveling with the relief fleet, who reminded me during one of those difficult moments that impossible tasks were rarely completed all at once. She had spent the day working alongside local Drenic technicians, most of them exhausted and half convinced their efforts no longer mattered, helping repair failing shield generators in 3 of the worst affected districts, buying those communities precious additional time before the next wave of shuttles could reach them. She told me that her people had a saying about eating an enormous meal one bite at a time, and that saving a world worked much the same way, one shuttle, one family, one repaired generator at a time, until eventually the impossible task simply became a task that had been completed. Word of the growing relief effort reached other delegations within days, and not all of the responses that followed were kind. A Thorin observation vessel arrived in our system on the 3rd day, its crew documenting the human effort not to assist but, as I later learned, to gather evidence for the formal complaint, still moving slowly through council channels back at the station. I watched their sleek, unmarked ship hang in orbit above us, doing nothing to help, while its crew recorded every detail of an operation that was, in that same moment, saving thousands of lives their own government had declined to lift a single vessel toward. I felt a bitterness toward them I had not expected, though Ruth Fields, when I mentioned it to her, over a strained communications link from the station, told me not to waste my remaining strength on anger toward those unwilling to help. She said the work itself would speak louder than any argument I could make on its behalf. By the end of the first week, the relief effort had grown far beyond the initial handful of ships that departed the station in those first frantic 3 days. Word had spread through human worlds of what Laura and Daniel and Ruth had begun, and rather than the disciplinary consequences some officials had threatened, an increasing tide of public support back on human territory began pushing additional resources toward the crisis. Official channels finally catching up to what individual people had already decided to do without waiting for permission. Additional ships arrived daily, some sent by human governments now scrambling to formalize what had begun as an act of defiance. Others crewed entirely by volunteers who had simply heard what was happening and refused to stay home. I remember standing on the observation deck of Daniel's ship during the 2nd week, watching a dozen vessels moving in careful coordination above my homeworld, shuttles descending and ascending in a rhythm that had, through sheer necessity, become almost graceful despite the desperation driving it. Daniel joined me there, looking as exhausted as I had ever seen him, his uniform stained with the dust of a dozen different evacuation sites he had personally helped coordinate. I asked him whether he had expected, 3 days after that council hearing, that this was what his small act of defiance would grow into. He laughed, a tired sound with little humor in it, and told me that he had not expected anything at all beyond getting the first ships loaded and moving before the council found a way to stop them. Not everything went smoothly during those difficult weeks. A shuttle carrying nearly 300 evacuees from a southern farming district suffered a critical system failure during ascent, forcing an emergency landing that injured dozens and left the surviving passengers stranded for nearly a full day before a rescue team could reach them. I sat with Grace Turner, the pilot who had flown that shuttle, in the hours after the incident, watching her relive every decision she had made in the frantic moments before the failure, convinced she had somehow caused the disaster through some overlooked mistake. It took Ellen Marsh's careful technical review, confirming that the failure stemmed from strain the aging vessel had never been designed to handle, rather than any error on Grace's part, to finally ease some of the guilt weighing on the young pilot's shoulders. Even then, the fear of another failure hung over every subsequent flight, a reminder that the effort we were undertaking, however remarkable, carried real risks that no amount of determination could fully eliminate. Despite these setbacks, the numbers continued to climb. By the end of the 3rd week, the combined relief fleet had evacuated nearly 200,000 people from the most severely affected regions of my homeworld, a figure that would have seemed impossible standing in that council chamber less than a month earlier, and yet still represented only a small fraction of what remained to be done. I spent those weeks moving between evacuation sites, coordinating with my sister's network of local volunteers, translating between Drenic officials still struggling to accept the scale of what was happening, and human coordinators working at a pace that left even their own colleagues struggling to keep up. It was during the 4th week, standing at yet another evacuation point, watching another line of exhausted families board another shuttle, that Ruth Fields arrived unexpectedly aboard a small transport, having traveled from the council station herself to see the relief effort firsthand. She found me near the loading platform, and though she said little at first, I could see something shift in her expression as she watched the operation unfolding around her, the sheer scale of coordinated effort that had grown from a single woman refusing to sit down when the council told her to wait her turn. She told me, once we finally found a quiet moment away from the noise of the evacuation site, that the formal council vote on sustained long-term relief for my people was finally scheduled, that the sheer visibility of what humanity had already accomplished, broadcast now across a dozen different networks throughout council space, had made it politically impossible for other delegations to continue stalling. She said that sometimes the only way to move a body as vast and cautious as the council was to prove that the alternative, watching from the sidelines while someone else simply acted, was far more embarrassing than any risk involved in finally joining the effort. I asked her whether that meant other delegations would finally begin sending ships of their own. She told me that several already had, quietly, almost sheepishly, as though hoping no one would notice how long they had waited before finally deciding that a dying world deserved their help after all. I felt no particular anger toward them in that moment, only a tired kind of understanding. They had needed proof that helping was possible before they were willing to risk anything themselves. The humans had simply decided to become that proof rather than wait for someone else to provide it. That night, standing again on the observation deck as another wave of shuttles descended toward the darkened surface of my homeworld, I allowed myself, for the first time since this crisis began, to imagine a future where my people actually survived it. 2 years passed before I stood in the council chamber again, and in that time, my homeworld went from a dying planet counting down its final months to an empty one, its cities silent, under a sky that no longer held any of my people to see it. I will not pretend the evacuation was flawless, or that every life was saved. It was not, and there are names I still carry with me, families who did not reach the shuttles in time, communities too remote for even the most determined relief effort to reach before our sun's collapse finally sealed their fate. Grief for those we lost lives, alongside gratitude for those we saved. And I have come to understand that both can be true at once, without one diminishing the other. In the end, just over 530 million of my people were evacuated from our homeworld before the final collapse, a number that would have seemed like an impossible fantasy standing in that chamber 2 years earlier, kneeling on cold tile and begging strangers to simply look at what was happening. Nearly 70 million lives were lost, a number that still sits heavy in my chest every single day, a number I refuse to let myself forget, even as I try to hold gratitude for everything that was saved, rather than despair for everything that was not. The resettlement itself became its own long and complicated chapter, one I do not think anyone, human or Drenic, fully anticipated when those first ships launched in such desperate haste. Human worlds, it turned out, were not simply willing to rescue my people from a dying planet, they were willing to make room for us afterward, offering land, resources, and support with a generosity that continued to surprise me even after everything I had already witnessed. Laura Bennett, who I had come to consider something between a colleague and a dear friend over those 2 difficult years, once told me that her people understood something about displacement that many older, more settled civilizations seem to have forgotten. That a rescue which ends the moment the ships stop flying is not truly a rescue at all, only a delay before the same suffering finds a new place to continue. I settled, along with several thousand other Drenic families, in a growing community on the edges of a human agricultural world called Ashford Hollow, a place with soil rich enough to remind some of our older farmers of the fields we had lost, and a sky gentle enough that our children could finally sleep without flinching at every flare of unfamiliar light. It was not our homeworld. It would never be our homeworld. But it was safety, and after 2 years of watching my people scattered across a dozen different worlds while their own dying planet burned behind them, safety felt like more than enough to be grateful for. My sister found her way to Ashford Hollow 6 months after the final evacuation ships departed our system, having stayed behind coordinating relief efforts in the last, most dangerous districts until there was truly nothing left to coordinate. When I met her at the small landing strip built at the edge of our new settlement, she looked older than I remembered, worn thin by months of work I could only imagine, but she was alive, and she was there, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I allowed myself to simply hold my sister without the weight of some larger crisis pressing down on both of us. The Council, to its credit, did eventually formalize its support for the ongoing resettlement effort, providing resources for permanent housing construction, medical support for those still suffering the lingering effects of exposure to our collapsing atmosphere, and educational programs to help our children adjust to lives on worlds their parents had never expected to call home. It took time, and it took the continued visible pressure of human involvement to keep other delegations from quietly allowing their commitments to fade once the initial urgency of the crisis had passed. But it happened, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that most large and complicated efforts eventually happen when enough people simply refuse to let them fail. I returned to the council station 2 years after that first desperate hearing, not as a supplicant this time, but as an invited witness before a subcommittee reviewing what had become known throughout council space as the Drennick precedent, a case study in how quickly and effectively a crisis response could unfold when species chose to act before waiting for perfect consensus. I stood in the same vast chamber where I had once knelt on cold tile, though this time I remained standing the entire length of my testimony, my legs steady beneath me in a way they had not been during that first desperate plea. The Vorn elder who had presided over that original hearing was still there, older now, her measured patience tempered by something new, a willingness to acknowledge, however carefully worded, that the council's traditional caution had very nearly cost my entire species its existence. She asked me, during the formal questioning portion of the review, what I believed the council could learn from what had happened, both from its own initial failure to act and from the human delegation's decision to act without waiting for permission. I told her the truth, as plainly as I could manage. I told her that compassion delayed by endless process becomes indistinguishable from indifference, no matter how genuinely a governing body might believe in its own good intentions. I told her that the humans who saved my people were not reckless, as some delegations had accused them of being in the aftermath of that first hearing, but simply willing to accept the discomfort of acting under uncertainty rather than the false comfort of endless deliberation while people died waiting for a decision. I told her that 100 species sitting in careful agreement about the value of caution had nearly let my entire civilization vanish from the galaxy, while a handful of individuals from a species barely a century into interstellar contact had refused to let that happen simply because refusing felt like the only decent choice available to them. I do not know how much of what I said actually changed anything within the council's deeper structures. Institutions built over centuries do not transform overnight because one grateful survivor stands before a subcommittee and speaks honestly about what he witnessed. But I have heard, in the years since, that the Council's response protocols for emergent planetary crises have shifted, if only slightly, allowing for faster provisional action in situations of immediate, verified threat to a species' survival, rather than requiring the same lengthy review process regardless of how much time a crisis could actually afford to lose. It is not everything. It is, perhaps, a beginning. Laura Bennett, I should mention, never faced the disciplinary consequences some had predicted for her actions in that first hearing. If anything, the visible success of the relief effort transformed what might have been considered reckless defiance into something closer to celebrated precedent, at least among those willing to acknowledge how close my people had come to disaster before she stood up. She never seemed particularly interested in whatever recognition came her way, however. When I asked her, during a visit she made to Ashford Hollow nearly 3 years after that first hearing, whether she felt proud of what she had accomplished, she told me that pride was not really the word for it. She said it simply felt like the only thing worth doing at the time, and that she did not think anyone deserved special credit for refusing to watch a preventable tragedy unfold without at least trying to stop it. Daniel Cross eventually left active relief work to help train a new generation of pilots and coordinators specifically for rapid response efforts, drawing directly on the lessons learned during those chaotic early weeks above my homeworld. Grace Turner, who had carried such heavy guilt after that difficult shuttle failure during the second week of evacuations, went on to fly dozens more successful missions before eventually training pilots of her own, including, remarkably, several young Drenick volunteers eager to give back to the effort that had saved their own families. Ellen Marsh continued working alongside Drenick engineers long after the initial crisis passed, helping design more resilient infrastructure for our new settlements. Infrastructure built to withstand disasters we hoped never to face again, but no longer took for granted that we were safe from. Ruth Fields remained a steady, quiet presence throughout the entire resettlement process, navigating the complicated political landscape between human governments and council bureaucracy with a patience that never once curdled into the same paralyzing caution that had so nearly doomed my people in the first place. Sam Whitfield, the young volunteer who had worked beside me during that first grueling week of evacuations, chose to remain in our community permanently, eventually marrying a Drenick woman from one of the northern cities he had helped evacuate, a small and quiet joy that felt, to me, like one of the truest measures of everything the relief effort had actually accomplished, beyond the raw numbers of lives saved. As for myself, I remained on Ashford Hollow, helping build the kind of life for my people that I once feared we would never have the chance to build anywhere at all. I planted a small garden outside the modest home I shared with my sister, filled with seeds we had managed to preserve from our homeworld's northern farmlands, a stubborn, defiant little patch of green that reminded us both, every single morning, of everything we had lost and everything we had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, still managed to keep. I think often about that moment in the council chamber, kneeling on cold tile with my forehead pressed against unforgiving stone, certain that I had failed, certain that I would carry the weight of an entire dying world back to a homeworld with nothing to offer it but the knowledge that no one had been willing to help. I think about how close that moment came to being the end of my people's story, rather than its turning point, how easily an entire civilization could have simply faded from the galaxy while ancient, careful institutions debated the proper procedure for acknowledging its passing. But I also think, more often now, about the sound of a chair scraping back against the floor of that vast chamber, about a woman rising to her feet before anyone had given her permission to speak, about a species so young to the wider galaxy that older civilizations still spoke of them with careful condescension, choosing in that critical moment to act with a decency that put centuries of practiced caution to shame. I think about ships breaking away from a docking ring only 3 days after that desperate plea, about children lifted from a dying world into a future no one had guaranteed them but everyone involved had refused to give up on anyway. I have learned, in the years since that first hearing, that dignity and desperation are not truly opposites, however much I once believed they were. I knelt on that chamber floor because I had nothing left to offer my people but my own humility laid bare before an audience of strangers, and I have never once regretted that choice, even knowing now how close it came to accomplishing nothing at all. What I learned from watching Laura Bennett rise to her feet that day, what I have carried with me through every difficult year of rebuilding since, is that sometimes the most powerful answer to another being's suffering is not a careful, measured, procedurally sound response at all. Sometimes it is simply showing up, imperfectly, urgently, without waiting for permission, because waiting was never truly a neutral choice to begin with. Waiting was always, quietly and comfortably, a choice to let someone else's world keep burning. My people survive today because a handful of strangers from a species barely old enough to understand the full weight of what they were choosing decided that a dying world mattered more than the comfort of doing things the proper, patient, careful way. I do not know if the Council has truly learned the lesson I tried to offer them in that subcommittee hearing 2 years after my desperate plea. Institutions are slow to change, even when the cost of their slowness is measured in millions of lives rather than simple inconvenience. But I know what I learned. kneeling on that cold floor and rising again into a future I once believed my people would never see. I learned that the measure of any civilization is not found in how carefully it debates the suffering of others from a comfortable distance, but in how quickly it is willing to close that distance when someone finally asks for help. I learned that young does not mean reckless, and that caution, left unchecked by compassion, can become its own quiet form of cruelty. And I learned, standing now on a world that was never meant to be my home and has slowly, patiently, become exactly that, that sometimes the loudest and truest answer to a dying world's plea is not found in careful words at all. It is found in the sound of ships breaking away from a docking ring, racing toward a sky on fire, because someone, somewhere, finally decided that waiting was no longer an option they were willing to accept. I pleaded with the council on my knees, certain that I had nothing left to offer but my own desperation laid bare before an unmoved audience of strangers. But only the humans listened, and because they listened, my people are still here to tell this story at all.